Hello, and welcome to the Scott Mize Show, a podcast focused on health, diet, bodybuilding, and philosophy. I interview experts, doctors, coaches, and N=1 case studies to answer your questions about improving health, achieving your best physique, and making sustainable progress. We'll cover topics from carnivore and ketogenic diets to bodybuilding to life philosophy and everything in between. Enjoy the show. This episode is brought to you by LMNT Electrolytes. This month, we're switching it up with an exclusive offer that's only for VIP LMNT partners, including Carnivore Cast listeners. You can now receive this free sample pack along with any regular purchase when you use my custom link, which is provided in the show notes or my Instagram link in bio. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, all one word. And as I said, I'll include the link in the show notes. LMNT Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious, and get yours today to help support the show. Thank you. This is a quick disclaimer before we start the show. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said here should be taken as medical advice, and please consult with your physician before making any changes to your diet, exercise regime, or medications. Thank you, and on to the show. Kolton Lukes is a natural pro bodybuilder who has been bodybuilding since he was 12 years old. He was born with cerebral palsy, served 8 years in the military, and has a degree in science and nutrition. He's helped hundreds, if not thousands of people reach their physique and health goals and has an incredible amount of knowledge on nutrition, training, and PEDs. Kolton is my go-to source of information with regards to the latest bodybuilding research. And he has an excellent YouTube channel where he posts all kinds of useful, interesting, and unique content. Welcome to the show, Kolton.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. That was quite the intro.
Yeah, of course. And I've been following you all the way back, like 2018 or so when we were both coached by Alex Kikel.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's been a while. But I'd love to just start for folks who aren't familiar with your background. Where did you grow up? How did you get into the military and all that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a long story. It is honestly, it's a long story. I think my childhood in general, my upbringing was more tumultuous than probably most people's. When I was a kid, I didn't have a father. He was just kind of always out of the situation. So that led to a lot of issues. And anyone who's kind of been in that dynamic themselves likely knows what I'm referring to in that sense. But single mother, except she was an alcoholic. So she wasn't much of a mother. Lots of drug dependencies and stuff like that. And unfortunately, when I was 13-ish, I was removed from my home from Child Protective Services.
Wow.
So when that had happened, I was in Minnesota. I was in Plymouth, Minnesota. And I was removed from my home. And then I was bounced around in different group homes for a while as a kid. And then I finally landed with permanent custody in my aunt's possession, if you want to call it that, in my aunt's custody. So I lived with her on and off through high school. My last year of high school, I actually just lived with my friends. I didn't actually live with anybody that like in my family. And because of that, I hadn't developed the best behavioral habits, nothing crazy. I wasn't doing any crimes or anything wild like that, but it was just sort of rambunctious and rulelessness. I didn't love the idea of having a person tell me what to do. But in the same time, in the same breath, I realized that I did need some direction because I didn't want to end up like my familial life. And I wanted to definitely spread my wings a little bit further. So the military for me was something that I looked at as sort of an opportunity to get a system together, like a support system, ultimately, that I didn't have already. Because a lot of people had families that were helping them get into college. A lot of people had friends and systems that had been in place for years and years and years. And I really had none of that. And so the military was sort of a shortcut to getting those systems and getting financial aid and getting a lot of those things, as well as just a cool little side adventure to go on. And so at that point, I was living in Chaska, Minnesota, and I just like literally waltzed into a recruiter's office and was like, hey, I'm going to join. And then I joined. It was a wild time, honestly. It was a really, really cool time. I could talk about it a lot, but it was 8 years of service. I meant it to be only like a couple years, and it turned out to be 8. So, yeah.
Where were you deployed?
So I wasn't. I was okay. So I was technically deployed, but I don't think it's fair to say deployment. I have
Okay.
specific opinions on that, but there's differences, right? There's combat deployments and then there's like non-combat deployments. So
Sure.
I was fortunate enough to be in non-combat deployments for the most part.
Cool.
And a lot of that was like going to Norway, for example, and doing an exchange program with Norwegian soldiers and like learning how to train with them and like eat like them and do all the crazy shit that they
Wow.
do, which is like
That's
climbing
awesome.
mountain, bushing and stuff. Yeah, it was cool. It was really cool. Other stuff was like training in the Mojave Desert for months at a time and not going home and weird shit like that. But
Wow.
a lot of it was just around the United States. I mean, it was nothing crazy. Fort Benning, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Just all over the United States, training in different regions. All for something I never got to do. I was a cavalry scout, a 19 Delta cavalry scout, which is a combat MOS, and basically your forward reconnaissance, and it sounds fancy. Really, all it is you kind of go in front of everybody else and scope out the areas, map them out for the units behind you, and make sure they're sort of clear in terms of geographically speaking. Like a tank could go over the certain terrain that's ahead of them, and also that there's no enemies, or if there is, how to clear them. So there was a lot of like combats training in that, which was really fun, man. It was awesome. Very taxing, but it also did suck because I didn't get to use any of it because I was sort of in that weird time post 9/11, pre sort of all the shit that's going on in Ukraine right now and all that other stuff. So I didn't really get to go anywhere with my time. It was just sort of like nothing was happening in the world.
Got it.
And it is what it is. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Really cool. And thank you for your service.
oh shit.
What got you into bodybuilding and specifically natural bodybuilding? And then maybe we can shift from there into switching to enhance.
Yeah. So again, sort of the camaraderie thing and I've always been super hyper focused on goals. And it's been like a toxic trait maybe to me, but other people see it as like a really successful thing. I don't think so in some contexts. And it was one of the things where it was like I needed to find a goal. My friend was doing it, and I thought it was really cool what he was doing. Just because I always worked out. I since I was a very young, like 13, 14 years old, I was always in the gym training. Because it's all I had time to do. Like there was no family system to support me, and just I would stay after school for 3 hours because no one was there to pick me up, and just go into the weight room and train. And that's what I did for most of my time. And then I actually started dieting because I'd watch Ronnie Coleman and like how he did it. So I would dieting was just like eating as much protein as humanly possible in one setting. But it still got me quite a bit of results at my age. And then my friend started competing and he started cutting. And that was something I've never even contemplated before. And when he started doing it, I really admired the articulate process of losing fat while maintaining as much muscle as possible. And he was doing a natural show, and I was like, well, I'll give this a shot. And so like he did his show. 2 weeks later, I was like on board 100% in a prep and going full bore into a show. And immediately it just like something with it clicked with me so well. And I don't even know how to describe it, but it's just sort of the regimented, the 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 way you can sort of put down on paper what's going to happen the next day and then know as long as you do all of those things that you'll have an equated effect was a really enjoyable part of the process for me. And it wasn't necessarily who knew the most or who could have the best genetics. And in a lot of cases it is, but it was more so like just who literally could work the hardest for the longest amount of time. And I knew that if I would work harder, that the exchange for my hard working would be greater than, someone else's lack thereof hard working. Right. And I always say, like, you'll never regret working hard for something in your life because usually that's the one thing that was always worth it. And that happens to be the case here. And so I just sort of used like the military background and like the constant, this is a trend in what I say a lot, but like the suffering I had went through to sort of drive that into like doing insane, preposterous amounts of cardio, restricting tons of food. I mean, it was wild for the first prep I've ever done, but it worked out. And I got my PNB pro card shortly after that, which was cool. And then I moved on. I was done with it after that. Went into the NPC.
Yeah, what made you decide to go enhanced after getting your natural pro card?
So honestly, it was a whole bunch of things. For one, I always was well aware that there was performance enhancing being done in virtually all sports. I was pretty in the know with that stuff. I was starting to do research at a very young age, and was on the forums even at a very, very young age, which is an interesting experience. But I was never really bought into the fact of doing any of this stuff. I was just sort of more curious to see what was getting people these, almost unquantifiable results. Like, how the fuck does a human grow that big? Um, and so I'd go on the forums and I'd look at this stuff and I'd be like, oh, that's interesting, blah, blah, blah. And then fast forward right after the natural bodybuilding series, I had done like series of blood work and I was extremely hypogonadal. And I wasn't just hypogonadal because of a caloric deficit, but I was actually, it was theorized due to CT scans and stuff that my pituitary gland had actually partly ruptured due to concussive blasts from the military.
Wow.
So
Wow.
we'd shoot like 50 cals and 25 mics, but then there'd also be like the A1 Bradleys there, which are huge tank systems that the round's massive, right? So the concussive blast, I don't think people conceptualize what that means, but even in a 50 cal, which is a relatively small bullet, if you really think about it, the blast from one bullet being shot off shoots back like an arrowhead, right? You have this concussive force that shoots back. And if you're sitting back there, like, it rocks your chest. Like, if you've ever been at like a really loud concert where you're in front of the speakers and like the bass drum hits and it hits your chest, it's that exact feeling, but 10 times worse. So it was hypothesized that I lost function in my pituitary partly due to concussive blasts within the military. And so I started TRT as, just a complete need for me, honestly. It was like something that I was like, all right, I really want to try this. And obviously, like, if I'm doing this, I might as well experiment. So it started with TRT. Literally, like 2 weeks after that first show, I was like, let's do this. I've gotten, probably at that point, 16 months of lab work to determine whether this is actually real or not. I was 20 at the time and I was like just down. I was just like, let's do it. So I started at 125 milligrams of testosterone, which isn't much. But then that was just obviously the gateway sort of opening into me doing more and experimenting more and sort
Yeah.
of now taking all the things that I had read about and then implementing them in practice. And thankfully, I'd surrounded myself with some pretty good people at that point. So I was aware of generally what was smart and not smart. Even then, I still did a ton of stupid shit. But I did learn a lot through that process, of just experimenting and failing, to be honest, and hurting myself probably in the long run. But it was at the point where I started taking TRT that I was like, yeah, I probably should go into the MPC because I have this infatuation with sort of understanding pharmacology beyond just nutrition and training and all that stuff, which is cool. Pharmacology is sort of this new level of understanding that I think is so much more intricate and diversified than nutritional sciences or even exercise sciences in some senses.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I have a very similar story. I was hypogonadal. Mine was more so due to 8 years of competitive lightweight rowing and the
Oh,
chronic cardio, taking,
yeah.
NSAIDs every day, really poor nutrition practices. And my total testosterone was consistently between 100 and 150 for a year.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And amazingly, I didn't have any sexual side effects on that
That's
low of
crazy.
testosterone. But I had really poor body composition. On DEXA, my bone mineral density was 3 Z scores below the mean. So
Oh,
below
no.
osteoporosis levels of bone. Yeah. So that's why I started TRT.
Wow. That's really low. Man. I've never heard
Yeah.
of something like that
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. They can't call it they can't call it, uh, what's it called?
Osteoporosis?
They can't call it osteoporosis. Thank you, because you're not old enough. So the medical diagnosis is very low bone density for age,
That's very fascinating.
even though I had below osteoporotic levels of bone.
Yeah. Just
So
like, screw this guy.
yeah, crazy.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why I started TRT, and I also started at 125 milligrams, and I was a hyper responder. I gained 28 pounds of muscle and lost 16 pounds of fat on DEXA,
Wow.
and felt like a whole new person,
That's
obviously.
awesome.
Um, so where do you where did you get educated, and where do you continue to educate yourself on research around nutrition, training, PEDs? And one thing I really admire about you is you're so good at analyzing studies and getting so deep into them. So where do you think that came from?
Yeah. So, and I've told the people this a lot. So, I went to school at Purdue University. I went online for the most part because I was in the military while I was doing it.
Yeah.
So it's an online school. Then they have an accelerated program where if you're in the military or in emergency services, you can go through an accelerated program, which is basically they just let you take a ridiculous workload so you can get the course or the degree done sooner. And that's what I did. And it also covers it through the military GI Bill, all that stuff, which is really nice. And for anyone who listens to this and is in the military or a veteran, I recommend Purdue Global just because they take care of you so well. But anyways, I got my degree in nutritional sciences with them. And I'll be honest, like I think in reality, most people would say this about the degrees. It wasn't that I didn't learn that much
Yeah.
tangible stuff from school. It taught me a lot about how to read and write and be more articulate with talking and writing and analyzing data. And that's really where I learned most of the stuff to teach myself how to become an autodidact. So, like in college, I learned how to read data and actually extrapolate from data, results basically. And like sometimes the results that they list or the small little paragraph after the study that people always scroll down to immediately once they pull one open and read, sometimes that isn't telling the full story, especially if you don't look at methods and see how that was done. And it's like really fundamentally important to do that when you're looking at a study. So that's kind of how I garnered the first bit of my knowledge, was going through my degree and learning how to interpret research. But I didn't learn much from my degree, honestly, beyond some basic stuff, but it was mostly what I already knew. I think the most interesting stuff I really dug into is like biochemistry. And that was honestly a lot of math, and it kind of went over my head for the most part. So it is what it is. But the point at which I met this like convergence of really self-interest being in bodybuilding, pharmacology, and all that was right after sort of school. And then I had left the military, where I started really digging into research and like taking an astronomical amount of my time. And I used to have like printed booklets of studies that I had on like my reading list off of the side of my desk. I'd buy a printer, and I had like a pile of paper, like literally 12, 16 inches long of just studies I had to read. And I'd have a highlighter and I'd go through all of them. And basically I was just trying to accumulate as much raw data as possible. And that's essentially how I learned a lot of what I did. Then what I also did after that was link up with a lot of resourceful people. Like Vigorous Steve has been absolutely imperative to my progress as a bodybuilder and also a coach and educator. He sort of started my journey in this thing, and I was in his Facebook groups way back in like 2016, 2017, talking to him and, questioning things, talking about studies. And way back then, like we were communicating on a pretty regular basis. And then fast forward now, like I live very close to him, and we go out to dinner, once every other week or so. And he's an amazing guy to hang out with. But he also kind of pushes the envelope of like, hey, I read this many, like literally 152 studies on trenbolone, and this is what I came to as a conclusion. I'm like, okay, I need to do more, and it's kind of putting yourself up with someone who does a lot more than you, and then realizing like, okay, I have more to do. That really garners the interest into researching more. But what I do to learn more now is it's very simple actually, and I think the framework would be super well if people adopted it. Which is, I think about a subject that I'd like to learn more about, and let's just say it's clenbuterol, or yeah, let's just say it's clenbuterol. What I'd look for is the 5 most recent reviews on clenbuterol. So whatever those are, ideally, they'd be things on the pharmacokinetics or dynamics of clenbuterol. And then what I would do is use those review studies to obviously read, because that would basically take a glance at all the research that has been done categorically for clenbuterol in the past X amount of, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on what the review is going over. And then from that review, I would look into the cited data, and then it kind of just tails, like it starts here with the review, and then it pyramids out to the cited data, and then it pyramids out from the cited data from those studies. And then you
Mm.
just kind of go down the stream. And it sounds like a long process, and it kind of is, but it's a much more straightforward line to learning a great deal of intricacy when it comes to especially pharmacology, when you can go to a review and then pull apart the review for its cited data, and then continue down further lines of thought once you've reached that point. Because once you understand mechanism in humans, there's a lot more you can extrapolate from that.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It sounds like you have a very systematic process, and you're covering everything. Because to your point, a lot of people just stay very surface level and only read the abstract of one study without understanding the context of how all the body of research fits in with it.
Yeah, 100%.
What are your goals for your physique now, and how are you working towards them?
Yeah. Boy, so it's a tricky thing for me. I have cerebral palsy, which isn't like, I don't have the worst cerebral palsy in the world. And I think a lot of people categorize cerebral palsy as like this thing where you're sort of limping and you need canes, and you're unable to walk. And that's not necessarily the case for me. I can walk. I look pretty normal, but my right leg is significantly shorter than my left. And with that, I have almost virtually no right leg um, control. Like I physically can't move my foot if you wanted me to on my right leg, which is super weird.
Wow.
And my musculature is also extremely weakened just because I don't have neurological control over my right leg, which sucks. But so it's always a hard battle for me as to how far do I really want to take this thing. At the end of the day, like I know I won't be on the Olympia stage, but I would like to get my pro card. And then also with that, it's like this new combat sports thing kind of came about where I'm really intrigued by combat sports now and getting
Mm.
involved with those. And that's very counterintuitive to having a big physique. You can have a jacked physique, but you can't have like a big physique in combat
Yeah.
sports because it's just all metabolic work, like every day, all day. Um, and so that tears the shit out of you. And I've been trying to balance that. It just hasn't been working. So what I've kind of set aside, and through consulting with Steve and everyone else too, I'm so thankful to have these people around me, is kind of said like, hey dude, stop bullshitting yourself. Like you're not going to be a combat athlete anytime soon. Just focus on bodybuilding and try to do at least 2 to 3 more shows. And then if it's still not something you want to pursue at that point, then move to combat sports. I was like, that's fair enough. Like I can do that. So essentially, right now I'm in the off season and I'm pushing up calories as much as I can, and accordingly the PEDs as well. And I'm trying to put on enough weight to get to a competitive stage weight. Last time I stepped on stage, I was 207, probably way over dieted, but around 207 on stage. I'd like to get back on stage at like 225, 220, and have bigger arms, bigger everything realistically, but a lot bigger arms, and just sort of see what I can do. If I can qualify for nationals, that would be awesome. I've only qualified for nationals once, and then I didn't compete. And so I'd like to qualify again, actually compete in nationals, and see what I can do, and then kind of go from there with however things pan out.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's really cool to be able to reflect like that, because I think a lot of people just go by social media pressure or what other people think they should do, or going through the motions. And it's cool that you have that introspection and also the support network to help you make those reflections and be purposeful about it.
Yeah, I think the support network is absolutely massive, and it's again, it's something I'm so thankful for, and I could never, Paul and that crew, as well as Steve and the crew over here. It's great to have these people on my side.
Yeah. Talk about moving to Thailand. What prompted that, and how have you found it there?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So, sort of back to my roots of like unruliness when I was a kid. Obviously, 8 years of military isn't super. You don't have a lot of freedom, right? So, I left the military and I blasted myself with tattoos everywhere, and I was just like sort of expressing freedom as much as possible. Then I started businesses. I started real estate. I started coaching and some other stuff, and got, I don't want to say like really successful, but I think pretty successful, and just had sort of the ability to be mobile in a sense where I didn't have to essentially stick myself down to anywhere. I could move around. And I've always, since 2019, probably, have asked Steve so many times, like, how can I get it to Thailand? He made a whole YouTube video on it. He had on his Facebook page, he talked about it a lot. Like, there's so many different things, right? And every time he's just like, consolidate all your assets, sell everything, and just move. And I was like, it sounds like so much work. It's scary, like there's a lot of shit. And at the end of the day, I was like, I have nothing holding me back, and I'm making a sizable amount of income. I can make this transition if I really wanted to. And like literally it happened overnight. I just like bought the tickets and was like, let's go. And for me, it was just meeting. I went here for 10 days prior to that. And it was sort of really cool because, some of my coworkers / best friends are out here, Adam and a bunch of other folks. And we were able to connect and just kind of go around Thailand and just experience it, right? Steve showed us around, gave us some good spots for food, and we went to the gyms and just sort of like met everybody, right? And you really quickly find out that the United States is definitely one way of living, which is very saran wrap. Like it's very, you got bubble wrap all around you, right? Like even if you wanted to do something wrong, you're not necessarily able to do something wrong, right? Like there's so many systems and laws in place that there's not really an ability to fuck up in life very bad. In Thailand, it's sort of just like a free for all, and that's what I love about it. You can walk outside, and like about 2 weeks ago, there was a national holiday called Sangkran. And Sangkran is like this holiday where everyone sprays each other with water to wash off their past year's self. And it's this really big deal where they sort of, everyone, I mean, the whole entire country sprays each other with water, dumps water buckets on each other. I mean, it's literally the world's largest water fight. And what I mean by rulelessness is I would walk out of my driveway and there was a fire truck hosing people down on mopeds, like right outside of my driveway and like pushing them over, knocking them over. And these people are just like doing their thing, just getting knocked over by this. And it's like, everyone laughs, these people get knocked over and they're just like, ha ha ha. And they pick the moped back up and they drive on their way. And it's just like, and I'm very open about this. I don't have a license. I don't have registration. There's no insurance out here. You can just do whatever. As long as you take the risk, you can drive wherever you want. You can go wherever you want. You can spend a little money to get a little extra, whatever you want. And it's sort of like the liberty to just you're exposing yourself to risk, but at the same time, that risk is you're able to do the risk and get more reward, right? So you're not as restricted as you would be in the United States. For example, like I can't just pick up a car in the United States and decide to drive it around. I would need license and I would need registration and I need an insurance number. Here I can go buy a 1000cc bike and a motorcycle and have no license, no registration, no insurance, no identity, just give somebody cash and then they give me a bike and then I just drive it around. Like there's no registration to the bike or anything, and that's just one example. Now expand that over many different situations. Pharmacies having any drug you could think of in terms of like what we would use as bodybuilders. Gyms having more liberal rules as far as what you can do in a gym. And I mean, just like all this really cool shit. I guess I love the rulelessness of it and being able to do what you want. And then you play your cards, obviously, when you're doing what you want, and there's risk to it, but it's not like the cops aren't going to let you do what you want. It's like the cops will fuck you up if you do this thing wrong. And then it's a problem, right? So yeah, it's kind of nice like that.
That's super cool. It sounds like truly free or as close to free as possible.
Yeah.
Kind of the promise that America has, but doesn't really fulfill.
Yeah. And it surprisingly works. I mean, there's bad people out here, right? Like people will scam you and that's a real thing. Like but if you know your way around it, you can get like, no one's going to, the thing is everyone generally respects each other. So even though there's like rulelessness and you could, anyone can do really anything and it can get violent sometimes in some areas, right? Which it can anywhere. But for the most part, everyone sort of is so accepting that this is kind of how it is. Like the street doesn't have laws, even though it does. They're not like, trust me, it's not followed. As long as you sort of stay within this generally moral code where it's like you're not hurting other people and you accept everyone for who they are, you can live your life. And that's what I think I like most about being here is it's just sort of brand acceptance and not this reformism, which, I'm very democratic, like pro democracy, but also not very pro invasiveness in terms of
Yeah.
one's life.
Yeah, me too. I think if my wife and I didn't have corporate jobs, it would definitely be a huge consideration. It
Yeah.
sounds awesome to live there.
Yeah. It is.
Um, what is your approach to PEDs been, and how has it evolved over time?
Gosh.
Big question.
Yeah, these are good questions. So it started out, my approach was very simple. It was, and it's always kind of been testosterone as a primary androgen, followed by I call it like the golden triangle, right? Or the golden trifecta, which is like your testosterone, your growth hormone, and your insulin. And that was kind of like what everyone in my mind should start with. You have your testosterone base, which promotes a lot of anabolism, and then you graduate up to growth hormone usage, which promotes an additional amount of anabolism, and then you go into insulin, and that promotes another additional amount of anabolism. And then you don't really have to mess around with all the other anabolics that could potentially cause various side effects that are quite severe or maybe minimal, depending on which ones you choose. But usually it's a good route around trying to play around with which anabolic works best for you. And at the beginning of each bodybuilder's career, especially when they're just starting out, I would argue that most people just need to put on size. And so playing with other anabolics to get a certain effect isn't really worth it. It's like focus on putting on size by eating as much calories as possible, taking testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin, and you'll get indefinitely bigger for sure, linearly across the year. And you can do that for a very sizable, I mean, like truly, you could run a cycle like that for over a year completely healthy. If you started at like 200 milligrams or 125 milligrams, like we started at, and then titrate up from there, you can run that for so long without any negligible, with negligible health effects. And then sort of graduating from that, it's like once you become a bodybuilder and people are like, damn dude, you're fucking huge, it's like, okay, now let's graduate into some other anabolics. And especially if we're going to run into a prep, now we might look at DHT derivatives, like ideally primobolan, but mastron's more likely going to be the option just due to availability in most people's cases.
Yeah.
And maybe some other anabolics depending on the situation, like trenbolone if it's applicable in that individual's situation, or Anavar or Winstrol or things like that, depending on what kind of prep they're in. And then ultimately coming out of that prep, it's like another massing phase, which again is just pretty boring. It's testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, and a DHT compound. And that's sort of been what I've figured to be the answer for most things for the longest amount of time. Until probably like a year and a half ago, I was always on the side of the fence, which was lowest effective dose for longest amount of time. And then I started to sort of transition into, I don't necessarily think there is a lowest effective dose, but rather a dose that gets you the most amount of results. That is something you want to edge towards compared to taking the lowest amount, which maybe gets you a moderate amount of results.
Okay.
And that's very controversial when you say it, but what I just see so historically, because I was very, I was the kid on social media, like watching everybody preach about anabolics and like listening to what guys said they had taken, which might have not been what they taken or might have been, but likelihood is that they were lying, which was basically along the lines of just don't take anything you don't need. Like you only need 250 milligrams of test, and Lee Priest saying he only ever took 700 milligrams of testosterone or whatever he said, like at most. That's like what I believe. So it's like, oh, you don't need more at all. Like it just, least effective dose for the longest amount of time. That's the answer. And I still believe the longest amount of time, but sort of what I've transitioned to from talking to like literally everybody. And I'm so thankful for this again. Like Roman, Fritz, and Paul and Todd and Steve and all the bodybuilders here. It's sort of like coming to fruition that bodybuilders take a lot of gear. And there's no secret behind it, right? They take a lot of gear, and more gear equals more results. But the fine line is sort of for me now where I can push doses as much as tolerable by the individual, and I only will do that based on lab work. So there is no predefined amount of time. It is just a titration of doses up until we see a desirable effect. So usually, starting at something like 10 milligrams per kilogram and then titrating up without a ceiling necessarily. Obviously, there's going to be a limit, whether that's fluid volume or the person's just genetic ability, right? Sometimes they just lack the ability to put on muscle like another person would. So doing more past a certain point just really isn't effective. But ultimately, what I came to the conclusion of is creating that dose titration model, still having growth hormone in play, still having insulin in play, but using other compounds as well, like DHTs. For the most part, I also am a huge fan of equipoise as a coach. Most of my clients probably know this. And using that high dose up until a point where we get feedback from the body that things are not happening favorably. And so realistically, sometimes this doesn't happen. You can have people running androgens at a pretty high dose for 24, 36, 52 weeks realistically without any negligible effects at best at their health. And I'm looking at like a full comprehensive panel, not just the CMP and a CBC, but truly like a full cystatin C, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, homocysteine, truly looking through like all their lipid counts, not just, the summarized ones that you get on a normal CMP, but looking at like the lipidology and seeing what their lipoproteins are, their B's, their little A's, the big A's, then all the differentiation of lipoproteins beyond that, and testing that stuff. And if a person can handle that gear dose, we're going to run it for as long as they can handle it until we have some prehistorical information on maybe they can't handle it past a certain point. And so then we take note of that. Okay, after 24 weeks at this dose, this is where your health started to become deviated from what we consider to be favorable. So now we sort of take that practice and we just repeat. So now we come back down, we wait for metabolites to sort of fade out, improve health and function, which generally never gets too out of whack anyways, so it doesn't take very long, and then come right back up with things. And we have that sort of timeline spaced out with blood work and creating that sort of rhythm with things at that point moving forward. So it used to be basically, to answer your question, the way it's matured with my use and belief of PEDs is that I used to do lowest effective dose for longest amount of time. Now it's sort of highest tolerable dose for desired results, meaning if you are not getting the desired result that you want or which is realistic for you as a person, then a dose titration is needed until that desirable result is seen, and then maintaining that effect until your body's feedback has said otherwise in terms of blood pressure, blood glucose, heart rate variability, as well as all the internal lab markers as well. So I'm very pro high dose, but also pro checking your health very regularly, doing internal organ scans and seeing if things are actually being deviated from where they should be in terms of organ volume and organ function and sclerosis of your liver or kidneys, hypertrophy of the heart in specific ways, and ejection fraction, and seeing these realistic markers that we want to keep track of. As long as those are in the right track, I don't think there needs to be a refinement of you can't take this much because you're not this big, or you can't take this much because no one needs this much. I think it's just, as much as you need for the desired effect for the longest amount of time that your body can tolerate, and then repeat.
Yeah, very, very intelligent. And I think, there's a lot of people like to flock to the idea of lowest dose forever, like just safe bodybuilding, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But this isn't safe, and people also have different goals, which require more, and more does grow more muscle at the end of the day, as long as you're healthy. So I think that's very smart. And one thing you did a recent video on, and you kind of touched on it in your approach with how you talk about it with clients, is a lot of old school bodybuilders, and recently Samson talked about coming off, like going off all drugs for a period of time. And some people do it for like 4 weeks, which we can talk about why that isn't really coming off. And some people do it for longer, but why might that be a bad idea for progress and health?
Yeah. Oh man, it's such a funny thing you say that, because I actually just had another uh, potential client. We got on a call and I was talking to him about what he had been doing with a coach before, and it was something along the same lines of just coming completely off for 4 weeks and then starting a cycle back up. And it was the same sort of reiteration of the things I've mentioned in that video. But yeah, basically the idea of coming off. And Samson, granted, he could be lying, but in his case, he says that, and his coach, Milos, at the time, said that he was coming completely off of everything. So no
Yeah.
testosterone, no nothing. Like nothing was going into his body. And I find that just so absurd that people think that that's the healthy route. And they even preach it as, I'm on nothing, dude. It's healthy. It's good. Like, I'm not even taking anything right now, dude, or we're in a health phase, like, that kind of stuff. And I do think it's so flawed to think that even like these objective timelines or subjective timelines of you need 8 weeks off or you need 4 weeks off. Like that's where things get dangerous. At the end of the day, these drug metabolites you're taking aren't going to be, this is the fact that most people are aware of, is that drug metabolites take a long time to clear. It takes about generally 5 to 6 half-lives to eliminate a drug from your body. So if testosterone and theta is in your serum for, let's just say, 8 to 10 days, you're looking at a good 50-day range where you're still exposed to testosterone, and there will still be an inhibition of the HPTA axis. So ultimately, you still are on testosterone if you're taking off for 4 weeks, even if you stopped injecting everything. You're still on whatever you were taking, right? Especially if it's something like equipoise and decunate, and you're now exposed for the next 6 months more than likely.
Wow.
So there's a lot of conversation there, which is like, why are you even coming off at the end of the day? Like you're simply doing nothing for yourself besides stopping injection, which is fine. I mean, I get it, right? No one wants to be a pincushion. But the second point is sort of that when you do come off, and like preaching how cool it is to come off is one thing. And if you're talking about fully coming off, it's another thing, because when you do become hypogonadal, we know very clearly that it is much more deleterious to your cognitive function in terms of the development of cognitive disorders like dementia, like Alzheimer's, and developing early warning signs to those things, and even cerebral brain flow, like blood flow. So you lose the capacity to allow your brain to have sufficient oxygen carrying capacity because of the limited blood flow, combining words, blood flow. So it's super, super bad in terms of cognitive function to have hypogonadal levels of testosterone. It's also horrible for cardiovascular health because there's a lot of intricate roles that testosterone and estrogen play in manipulating in a positive manner cardiovascular, and more importantly, just in general, like circulatory systems, right? And if you have a lack of testosterone and estrogen, you're really screwing the pooch as far as your health goes long term. And it's almost, one would say, worse than if you were to be on a above physiological or normal dose of testosterone. What we do see is that when males are on normal gonadal, I think that's the correct clinical term, but like normal functioning testosterone levels, you don't have any of these effects. You have generally a good cognitive function. You don't have any malformation of organs or any sort of circulatory issues outside of possibly having a higher red blood cell count, which is easily treatable. And so coming off completely is just such a deleterious thing for your health, because now what you've done is you've exposed yourself to these extremely high doses of androgens for the prep or for the massing phase or whatever you're doing. And then you come off completely. And now, instead of having these nice, stable serum levels of hormones that generally will improve health and function, you now have floored, absolutely, hypogonadal levels of testosterone and other hormones, then therefore limiting your ability to improve health and sustain function in the human body. And so you went from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other end of the spectrum, completely derailing the train that you were trying to keep on the rail as you were getting there. And it just ends up not being good. And there's so many ways around it, which is like just taking TRT at the end of the day, like simply just injecting testosterone, even at a lower frequency, even at a lower dose. It's going to be so much better for you than just completely coming off. For 4 weeks, that doesn't really matter because you're still on. But if you're doing it for, longer, 8, 12, 16 weeks where you're completely coming off, you're definitely causing more detriment than good.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That's the best summary I've heard of why coming off doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, and I wanted to shift topics a little bit to talk about your approach to training and maybe how that's changed over time. I know you put out a video like 6 months ago about experimenting with RIR and volume progression. How did that go? And I guess we can start earlier. Like, how did you start training, and how did your training philosophy change as you got into this?
Yeah. Really phenomenal question, man. So my training philosophy is always, and this is, following the lines of the whole suffering. I have this huge, um, I don't know if you want to call it like a philosophy or what, but I believe that truly people do need to suffer more in most of their lives. Like it would do people well to accept suffrage, and at least know it's there as opposed to trying to ignore it and being more comfortable than anything else. And that kind of follows suit with training as well. For me, when I started training, it was all about training to failure and doing so almost irrationally. And it wasn't something that was probably really productive for me, but it was something that I didn't. Um, I made progress with it. It just was sort of destructive in terms of my bodily health. And so I was doing this sort of JP style training where it was like progressively overload as much as possible, usually 6 working sets per week on any given muscle. Most of that loading would be done via compound movements. And then the prioritization for accessory movements would be sort of thereafter those compound movements. And that for a long time, for my natural bodybuilding, for my first few years in the NPC, was all I was doing was just super, super heavy progressive overload, low rep ranges, 5 to 8 rep ranges, as much weight as I could put on the bar, literally, and then just repping it out. Then I sort of started to follow a couple different camps, and realizing sort of the value of improving form. There's I can't even remember his name. That's like Iron University on Instagram, and he trains with a lot of bikini athletes, and he specifically does a lot of work with their biomechanics and trying to get them to fundamentally understand how to actually activate the glutes, because it is a big problem for most females. Generally, most females don't even feel their glutes when they're training them. And he talks about it a lot. And he's sort of the one that cued me into a lot of other people in the space. And so it sort of develops down this route where I was like, okay, this is a whole aspect that I've never even focused on, which is like biomechanics, understanding, of course, I understand where muscle insertions and attachments are and the function of muscles, but cueing those muscles, putting them in a way that structurally aligns tissues to essentially contract and stretch with the most direct attention possible is something that's really valuable. And so I started to lower the weights, focused a lot more on form, which really didn't decrease my rep range or increase my rep ranges or anything like that. It actually probably maintained them because I was focusing more on being strategic and cerebral with how I lifted. And then, I moved to Texas at the time, and I was training with a guy named Nick Bagley and at Destination Dallas. And he's a coach there. He really focuses on movement, and training movement patterns over anything else. And he walked me through like a back day and just kind of taught me a lot of things about training my legs, especially with cerebral palsy, and showed me the value in definitely being like more cerebral, more contextually focused on what I'm doing as I'm training, as in like what I'm moving, what bones are moving, what joints are positioned where. Um, and that sort of leveled me into a different training camp, which was reps in reserve, right? And looking at the research there, listening to Mike talk about Dr. Mike Israetel talk about that a lot, and kind of listening into that camp for a while. So I wanted to try it, right? I was like curious because ultimately I'm burying myself in these sessions. I mean, every day it gets to a point where you're trying to be really productive and your training is so intense that when you finish training, it's almost like you have to go home and sleep because you're just so drained physically at some points, especially like after a really tough leg day or really, really heavy back session. And if I can avoid that and become more productive and supposedly improve my results and recovery, well, I'm going to take that bet. And that's what everyone was telling me. So I might as well try for myself. N=1. I might as well do the study. So yeah, like about 6 months ago, I tried doing the whole reps and reserve thing. And not much long after, about a month and a half to 2 months afterwards, I I just got bored. It really felt wrong being in
Mm,
the gym and I was training hard, but it's that extra level that you kind of differentiates you from the other people in the gym, I guess, that
yeah.
maybe it's egotistical. You can call it what you like, but there's something about training to failure and like true failure that is super exciting and super engaging. And like that feeling of just being drained is something I crave so much, that it was super boring not to train to failure and to actually hold myself back in a lot of different movements. And if anything, while it was maybe beneficial for recovery and energy, like energetically speaking, I could move into later sets of the workout with more capacity to do more. I still felt bored. And at the end of the day, if I'm going to be training 5 to 6 days a week for, the foreseeable future, every single week, I'm going to want to make sure this is something I enjoy doing and I can sustain it, even if the science says it's better for me. And I think there's the big caveat here with anything that's optimal. It's like, who is it optimal for? Is it
Yeah.
optimal for you? Is it optimal for me? Is because everyone's situation is a little bit different. And for me, I'm biased towards the personality type that's like, listen to sad music in the gym and then just like murder my feelings on the the hack squat. You know what I mean? So like I want to train intensely. I don't want to do the reps in reserve because it feels wrong. It doesn't feel like I'm doing enough to deserve the results, even though that isn't true necessarily. There could be some whatever. Trying to speak too much here. There could be some stratification on whether the person gets more results from reps in reserve or the person gets more results from failure. I don't know, right? I think more research is needed, and specifically more research on enhanced bodybuilders would be awesome. But for me, the failure training just works the best. And I think most people would probably agree with that if they are bodybuilders.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think sustainability and enjoyment is huge. I trained with reps in reserve or focusing on reps in reserve. I guess Dr. Mike would argue that everyone uses reps in reserve, whether they call
Yeah.
it that or not. But I did that style of training for a couple years and got great results from it, but I was overthinking everything. I was
Yes.
overanalyzing. The gym wasn't fun. I was constantly questioning, was this the right amount of reps in reserve? Oh, I feel
Mm,
good today. Should I go a little bit harder? Like, oh, how do I think about reps in reserve from one set to another? Like, this is my last
yeah.
set of the exercise. It was just like too much. So I just like to get in the gym and train hard. That's
Yeah, exactly. It's like that's a great point. Overanalyzing because it's you don't know what 2 reps in reserve is unless you
yeah,
know what 0 reps in reserve is. And it's like the only way I know what 0 reps in reserve is if I
yeah,
trained to failure. And if I trained to failure last week, who knows? I might be stronger this week.
yeah,
And it just becomes too much pontification and like this mental masturbation that's not necessarily fun. It takes it out of the
yeah.
time spent in the gym.
What areas of the research are you digging into now or finding the most interesting recently?
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I've moved beyond like anabolics and stuff like that. And I say this and I have like a whole review article pulled up right now about like relatively new data on a review article from 2022 on how testosterone administration does not affect or alter brain activity and stuff. But for the
Mm,
most part, I don't look into androgens at this point because there's not too much new and novel stuff coming out about them.
yeah,
And everything that could have been read has pretty much been read, outside of documents I don't have access to. So for me, what I'm finding really interesting is um, data on the ancillaries and that we tend to use. So like PSK9 inhibitors, 5-alpha reductase compounds,
cool.
anything really, nebivolol, propanolol, ARBs, like anything that kind of can go as an adjunct with androgens,
Yeah,
is something I'm very curious in. And then trying to find data that compare those things up in sort of a polypharmacy sense. So like,
mm,
what does testosterone do in conjunction with 5-alpha reductase inhibitors? And, there's great studies out there on that actually. Exogenous testosterone administration up to 600 milligrams in a controlled study with, 5-alpha reductase concurrently being dosed at, 2.5 milligrams per day with dutasteride. Really cool studies on that sort of stuff.
yeah,
And I think that's what's really valuable is trying to find any sort of polypharmacy that we can, because ultimately I don't think one bodybuilder is ever just using one compound. So yeah, I mean, my biggest things right now are definitely, I just love pharmacology, and so learning what these new and novel drugs do in terms of possibly aiding the bodybuilder's lifespan and or career capacity. And then going beyond that, and even, looking at selfishly, because at the end of the day, I can't remember who said it, but they said the good shit sticks, and it's very true. If I just read studies all day based on things I'm not really interested in at the moment, it's hard to remember that stuff. But if I'm looking at data or studies that are, I find, truly interesting, it's very easy to remember even hyper specific details on specific studies, but I have to find them truly engaging and like want to read them, right, and have that desire. And so for me, like, the good shit sticks is right now I'm interested in cognitive learning and like the processes to enhancing cognitive learning and memory retaining and those kind of things. So a lot of compounds are in that category of almost, what you would call like biohacking cognitive states. And it's something I'm really kind of investing a lot of time into now. Is it's not necessarily, it was never something I didn't research, but it's something that now I'm more interested in than I have been certainly in the past.
Cool. Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, I'd definitely like to do another episode with you on cognition and neurodegeneration from anabolics. One ancillary you might find interesting, I just learned about it yesterday, is empagliflozin,
Yes, yeah.
Jardiance. Yeah, really interesting, like alternative to metformin potentially for regulating blood sugar, and also has a lot of other side benefits for like heart health and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's funny. I can never say it. Empagliflozin.
Yeah.
It's funny whoever comes up with these names, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I run into is issues is when I'm reading studies, you don't have anyone like narrating the information.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes, like, I don't know how to pronounce the things that I'm reading
Yeah.
about. Fuck. Yeah, there's a lot of. It's funny you said that one, because I was just looking at that one too not too long ago.
Yeah. It's funny in J3 University, John Jewett, incredibly smart guy, love him, but he has some like weird pronunciations. Like instead of saying FODMAPs, he says food mops. And instead of satiety, he says satiety, or like he says it different every time. So yeah, it's funny.
Yeah. It's the funny shit that happens when you're by yourself all day and you just
Deep
read.
in the research. Yeah, exactly. What scares you personally most about bodybuilding with regards to health? Like for me, it's definitely neurodegeneration, because Alzheimer's runs in my family and it's just super scary. But curious what it is for you.
Yeah, it's a really damn good question, man. I think for me, it's also neurodegenerative. I think that for me, like, the brain is, as far as I can understand it, what we kind of classify as the soul. And once you lose cognitive function, you lose essentially who you are and your perception of who that even might be. And it's a very scary thought to like lose the ability to just think and to just understand. Like, what's really scary is like Alzheimer's patients die because their body has no connection with the mind, and the mind forgets to automate breathing. Right? They're basically like they can suffocate to death because their brain forgot to tell their body to breathe.
Oh my God.
And that's, like, a terrifying thought to me. And essentially, like, my goal in life is I want to be jacked and huge and stuff, but I also want to be brilliant, and I also want to do stuff with a future family, and have a collective of memories that I'm really grateful for. And I would hate to delete any of those capacities or things because I did something with compounds and the now. So for me, that's definitely the big one. I don't necessarily mind I think a lot of the things as far as kidney function and hepatic function and even, CVD risks with bodybuilding in general are pretty, you can mitigate them pretty well if you know what you're doing. And if you're testing appropriately, it's fairly easy to mitigate. But neurocognitive stuff is super hard to understand. We barely understand it now. And I mean, we were on this line of research for so long that amyloid plaque was what was causing Alzheimer's. And that turned out to be a completely fraudulent thing, and that started it all. And I'm just a mess of research. We don't even know anymore, right? Like there's no clue as to what causes the direct causal effect of Alzheimer's or dementia or any of these cognitive declining states. And so it's really scary because there's a lot of good research out there that supports 19 nortestosterone variants, trenbolone, nandrolone, causing some form of neurocognitive decline. And it's certainly something that I'm more concerned about than not.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Kolton. It's been awesome speaking with you after following you for all these years and learning from you. And I think you're such a great part of this industry. You help so many people and you're doing really good work. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Where can folks find you and reach out to you if they want to work with you or follow you? And I'll have links to everything in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I'm on Instagram, probably the majority of my time with shorts and content I'm posting there. So Kolton Fitness is where you can follow me there. It's pretty easy. And then I'm really trying to post and get very good with posting on YouTube. That's involving a lot of money, unfortunately, but I'm hoping it will pay off sooner or later. But I'm putting a lot of time into YouTube now. So you can just find me at my name, Kolton Lukes, on YouTube. And there should be a lot of content for people to skim through there that might be useful. Some of it might not be useful, but I think a lot of it is applicable if you're especially a bodybuilder.
Definitely a lot of interesting and unique content. Great. Well, thank you for your time, Kolton, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can find The Scott Mize Show on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please leave a comment, like, review, or share the podcast with your friends or followers. It helps more people find the show.